The title is Metaphoric Interweavings between the arts and technology, and really science, mathematics, different disciplines. And the metaphoric interweavings is these concepts that are coming from these different disciplines, and how those concepts really, when you think about it, those are the titles are metaphoric titles that really relate and interweave with other disciplines or amongst the disciplines themselves. A major influence on my work and my research is Leonardo da Vinci, and he says to us, "You who speculate on the nature of things, I praise you not for knowing the processes which nature ordinarily effects of herself, but rejoice if so be that you know the issue of such things as your mind conceives," that you know how your mind thinks, how your mind conceives things, and how those things are really reflective of the very nature of the thinking process. And he was one of the first to really look at dynamic phenomena, dynamic processes in the natural world, in nature. And towards the end of his life, he really reflects in his notebooks. Leonardo questioned the rigid conception of geometry and mathematics. He started to ponder where we somehow have conceived this in a rigid way when it's actually much, much more fertile when you bring dynamics into it, or when you contemplate dynamics. Keeping that in mind, remember that mind is a malleable pattern, or patterns, interweaving patterns, perceived by a mind, so it's reflective. Also, the mind is the seeing organ through the eyes, or better stated, the mind is the sensing organ through the senses, so it's reflective. In terms of pattern, Gregory Bateson, in his book Mind and Nature, he also tells us regarding dynamics, he writes, "We have been trained to think of patterns, with the exception of those in music," a very, very interesting point, "as fixed affairs, rigid affairs. It is easier and lazier that way, but of course all nonsense. In truth, the right way to begin to think about the pattern which connects, the patterns which interweave, is to think of it as primarily, whatever that means, a dance of interacting parts, and only pegged down by various sorts of physical limits and by those limits which organisms characteristically impose." So looking at patterns, so this is pattern generation through vibrations, and then also now through technology, pattern generation and form generation through computer modeling of dynamic phenomena and dynamic activity. So on the right you see fluids. It's a fluid that's subjected to vibrations and the kinds of patterns that are generated through these kinds of interacting frequencies and vibrations. I won't be able to get into the specifics of those because of time, but again, those are different fluids in a different frame, different kind of pan, and different vibrations generate, or interacting frequencies generate, these kinds of patterns. And these patterns look static, but there's actually dynamic activity flowing through this. And on the upper left, you see, when you look through a microscope and you look at the structure of materials, especially metals, you find dynamic patterns that are very geometric. But again, it's dynamic activity that is framed by what appears to be a static pattern. And then on the lower left is new technology. Computer technology is allowing us to model these processes, these dynamic processes, and we're finding new patterns and new forms, new shapes that are really inherently embedded in these patterns. But we can't see them, but we can see them through when we model them and we condense time through computer modeling. So modern mathematical modeling and pattern generation, again, now fractals. Again, when we're modeled dynamic activity, we're finding there are these patterns. So you see here, these are fractals. And there's self-similarity at different scales of structure. So as you zoom in to these patterns, you actually find the same structure at a different scale, self-similarity. It appears the same. But what is very interesting is as you zoom in, the actual physics can change. It can generate incredible behavior. It looks the same, but it actually generates incredibly different kind of physics. Also, it seems to defy the physics that we know at this scale. In terms of mathematical modeling, this is from the 19th century. Just going to need to read a brief statement regarding, these are two mathematicians. So in the 19th century, there were very interesting new ideas and concepts being developed. The French mathematician Théodore Olivier, his belief in the importance of physical models as an intuitive tool to assist in the visualization of difficult analytic mathematical concepts originated from the influence of his teacher, the French mathematician Gaspard Monge. Monge made considerable contribution to the classification of three-dimensional surfaces by the spatial traces defined by the movement of a line. So all of a sudden, a straight line and the kind of movement that it can do and the surfaces that it can generate started to be studied mathematically. These investigations would eventually lead to the construction of intricate physical models composed of tightly stretched strings, as you see on the top. Théodore Olivier would eventually construct and expand upon the potential that these models offered to the intuitive understanding of mathematically complex analytical concepts. Olivier's string models were initially the state-of-the-art in mathematical theory and visualization. His great contribution through these models was the incorporation of motion into the visualization of the relative intersections of three-dimensional surfaces. So you can see on the left, those are not intersecting, but some of the models, those forms, those shapes, those surfaces intersect. And this was a great tool in terms of visualizing those intersections. And this was the first time that those things were being done. Movable metal frames would allow the surfaces to be modeled, and relative to one another, their changing intersections would be clearly visualized and studied. The introduction of the dynamics of relative motion into these models was the significant pedagogical breakthrough and contribution by Olivier. So these models initially were string models, but eventually the models led to plaster casts of the kinds of surfaces. That's what you see on the bottom. Now, these models were used to teach architecture, to teach design. So a young Antoni Gaudí was studying this, and he was one of the first to really incorporate this into his architecture. This is the Sagrada Familia. So a lot of the intricate ceiling work that you see on the upper right in the nave is actually intersecting surfaces or shapes in terms of straight lines. The straight line makes it easy to actually build it. And he was one of the first to really take that to an extreme. And this is a perfect example. Now in Paris, those models were on display at the Henri Poincaré Museum. These models were on display. This is in the early 19th century. So in the 30s, 20s and 30s and 40s. So Man Ray, the Surrealist artist, as well as other Surrealist artists, they were intrigued by these models. They were looking at these models. They were intrigued by them. They didn't understand the mathematics, but for them, they were surreal shapes, surreal. They were surreal in terms of what they were trying to do through their work. So they drew inspiration from this. And these are the photographs by Man Ray of these models, and 2 paintings by him, and 2 additional photographs of the models. Again, these are plaster casts that were on display. And then eventually that started to spread amongst other artists. So Naum Gabo, Russian-American sculptor, these are his sculptures. Again, there's a frame, and that frame allows him to stretch either a metal wire or a filament, and so you see the surfaces that would be defined as well as intersecting. This is around the same time that Cubism was influencing the artists. Another artist was Barbara Hepworth, English sculptor, who was actually a student of Naum Gabo. I'm just showing you a few But again, these things were very, very influential and were very, very popular. At the same time, this is a little bit later, it was also influencing architects. This is Eduardo Catalano, his house. He's an architect, 1954. He constructed this house. It's a house where the roof is a hyperbolic paraboloid surface. It's literally generated by the movement of a straight line at about an axis. Very influential. It put him on the map, literally, throughout the world. And then also the Philips Pavilion, 1958. This was by Le Corbusier, as well as, this was an interactive collaboration, although Le Corbusier may not think of it that way. But he worked with Ioannis Xenakis. He was an experimental composer and designer who was working in his office. Le Corbusier was very busy in India with another project. So Xenakis actually is the one that designed it, although Le Corbusier takes full credit for it. So he was a very famous experimental musician, composer. And also Edgar Varese was the composer of this music for the main space. So this was the state of the art in terms of sound, light, film, and sculpture within the space. All of these surfaces are generated by the movement of a straight line. Right now, at this very moment, the Robert Lepage, Canadian theater designer, really Renaissance artist, he did the Wagner's Ring Cycle at the Metropolitan Opera in New York City. And this is the set. It is actually literally a ruled surface that is controlled, computer controlled, to the music or what's happening on stage. These are a few examples of this. So there's also high definition video projection, motion sensors, voice activated imagery, incredibly complex. All of this is available online, by the way. That's his little study model on the left, on the lower left, and you can see the intricate machinery that's used for this. So again, this is literally, it's going to have another run in the coming year. And additional views of that undulating surface and more views. So he really makes the most of this surface and the potential that it has. And this is quite recent. I actually came across this on Sunday in the New York Times. It's called The Ascent by XXY Yehuda Dueñas. This is from the website. It's a mashup of theater, attraction, installation, game, an iconic spiritual simulation, a live action performance installation that allows individual participants to levitate over 30 feet into the air through interactive sound and lighting via the power of their own focus and meditation. The reason I'm bringing you this one, I'm showing you this one, is because all of a sudden now we're actually tapping into brain activity as something to tap into to move things. So this was done at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute at MPAC, which is an experimental media and performing arts center. So quoting the designer, the user straps into a harness and wears an EEG headset. As the user begins to clear their mind and focus, they begin to levitate into the air. A storm of sound and light conspire to distract the user from their goal by becoming the key figure in an ascending Renaissance tableau 30 feet in the air. The user has to stay calm and focus through the incredible amount of stimulus. Part speculative simulator, part internal spiritual experience, part Renaissance spectacle, part interactive ride, a mashup of theater, ride attraction, installation, game, and iconic spiritual simulation. The experience invites users to launch themselves 30 feet into the air using EEG, electroencephalography, which is a process that records electrical activity from neurons in the brain. So this is actually what is incorporated into the movement. These are some visuals. And actually, this is something that is traveling, and it could be brought to Ottawa if we wish. So, so I'm going back in time now. So, that idea of that previous project has been done before in different ways, in a very different way. These are the Whirling Dervishes, the power of focus and meditation, and another participatory form of performance towards levitation and mental visualization. So spinning in place as you spin around a room, and you do this in a meditative state, you will become, quote, one with the cosmos. I've never done it, but this is what I hear. But I also know that the artist in the previous project has these kinds of things in mind. So technology is offering us to look at some of these things from the past, and how can we use technology to bring this into the public awareness. Now, in terms of mental images, the mental images depicted through migraine art. So migraines, people that suffer from migraine headaches, before the pain, they have these visuals, and these are the kinds of visuals. They're very, very interesting what the visuals are, and what is it that they're seeing in terms of what the brain, the mind is doing. There are additional images. Sometimes it looks like a cubist painting, perhaps. Now, Oliver Sacks has studied patterns in migraines, and he says, we still have only a very primitive understanding of what, to my mind, are among the most intriguing phenomena of migraine, the geometric hallucinations it so often evokes. What we can say in general terms is that these hallucinations reflect the minute anatomical organization, the cytoarchitecture of the primary visual cortex, and the ways in which the activity of millions of nerve cells organizes itself to produce complex and ever-changing patterns. We can actually see, through such hallucinations, some things of the dynamics of a large population of living nerve cells, and, in particular, the role of what mathematicians term deterministic chaos is in allowing complex patterns of activity to emerge throughout the visual cortex. This activity operates at a basic cellular level, far beneath the level of personal experience. They are archetypes, in a way, universals of human experience. And so we're finding ways of actually visualizing brain activity, modeling brain activity, and gaining insight in terms of what it says about us, how reflective it is. He goes on, Oliver Sacks, where he says we should start looking at ancient arts, and we start to see these patterns and these visuals. So similar patterns are found in basketry and in pottery, ancient architecture and art. I'm only showing you a few, but you can also show Islamic architecture, tapestries. Now, through my own work, I also started to incorporate dynamics. And one of the things I did very early was literally borrow a potter's wheel. And what you see here is a potter's wheel with a wooden frame, and that wooden frame is secured to the potter's wheel. It allows me to take a cylinder with a lid, and I can put that cylinder on the frame at any angle that I wish. And I put boiling water in it with melted wax. Close the lid, secure it to the potter's wheel, leave it on, turning as fast as possible for an hour or two. I come back, it has cooled. So there's a vortex, and the wax and the water do not mingle, they separate. So the wax stays on the surface, and it actually casts that surface. So these are two casts so they're seashells. So it's a way of generating a form from a dynamic, or casting a form from a dynamic situation. That same potter's wheel was used to spin a string. Upper left, you see the string hanging down. I like to show them upside down because they look like columns. They look like, for me as an architect. Now I called it Ariadne's thread in the dynamic and chaotic vortex. Ariadne gave Theseus, the first architect, a ball of thread. When he entered the labyrinth, he can unwind the ball of thread so he can find his way back out. What's the metaphor there? So these ancient myths, these ancient Greek gods, there's something about their nature, their makeup that is informative. There's something that these intuitive traditions learned through insight. And there's an embedded message there for us to think about, to reflect. That's why that's the name. So you can see a single string, different loops, and again, the different kinds of forms that are generated depending on the speed of the spinning wheel. I also recorded, I put a camera on the wheel or put the camera on the floor. So on the bottom you see, those are stills from the video. That's Ariadne's ball of thread. On the top, you see stills from videos where the camera is actually spinning with the string. So the camera is literally spinning, so you actually see a line that slowly turns, and it looks like an ocean wave. That's why I also called it Ariadne's thread, Rumi's ocean. Rumi was the founder of the Whirling Dervishes. So it is totally intentional in terms of this interweaving of metaphors. And then taking some of these stills and then literally collaging them together, trying to see the kinds of line, Ariadne's thread. And they have a certain resonance, these lines. They look like calligraphy, Islamic calligraphy. There is something that resonates for me in terms of with us, I believe. And it's very interesting how it was generated through a technical process, yet at the same time, something incredibly fluid and sensual comes out of this. As well as sweeps of the string, the kinds of surfaces, and how could these surfaces, so the string that was taught in the other models is now hanging and, in a sense, spinning. Now we're generating different kinds of surfaces. How can those surfaces be constructed? And collaging some of those sweeps just to see as a speculative spaces, speculative possibilities for architecture or form making. So these patterns, so we can actually draw very simple patterns, squares, hexagons, triangles, on paper or on cardboard, fold them, make different folds, different folded patterns. You will be surprised at the dynamics of that folded pattern and the undulating malleability of that surface. As well as taking basic shapes, a triangle, a square. What you see here is shish kebab sticks joined with rubber bands. So each one of those shapes it's a dance of interacting parts. You take that cell and you start joining them together through a process of slowly building up a surface or a three-dimensional arrangement. On the left is a surface made with squares, and that surface is undulating and has incredible properties. So those are improvisations that slowly, as I start to understand the properties of this three-dimensional surface, I was able to appropriate those into an installation. This was part of a symposium. The symposium also, by the way, was called Metaphoric Inter-Weavings. So you had somebody was playing, describing musical structure in terms of Johann Sebastian Bach and fugues and the idea of a cell that becomes the composing unit, and that cell is stretchable, it's compressible. That cell, that musical phrase is actually alive, and that musical phrase is used to compose. Also a weaver, the idea of a weaver using a cell also through the weaving process, or knitting as well. And then architecture, showing architecture, Islamic architecture, and how the cell is used in architecture as well. Again, depending on where you're looking from, you see incredible patterns that shift and change completely. Sometimes it's chaotic and sometimes very regular. And another installation through the same process. And at the bottom, you see these were inspired by Leonardo da Vinci's deluge drawings. Again, where he's looking at water and the turbulence of water. And again, I give, in my workshop, I give students a cell to work with, or a group of students. So I let them explore. And they don't know where it's going. Very important. So a square or a triangle, and these are the kinds of projects that they've done. I won't be able to get into the details of each one. But again, these kinds of things were not expected. Another one of those projects, the same structure, depending on where you're looking at, the angle you're looking from. Sometimes it looks like a circle, a circular structure, or undulating waves on the right, or a grid structure. It's the same structure, it's just a matter of where you're looking from. And this one, incredible structure also where the shadows start to look organic. This was a 7-sided cell. One of the best projects really done by students, by this particular student. Now, in my own work, this is a folded paper model, and I was very interested in the properties of this undulating surface, could this be a pavilion? Could this be architecture? How could it be built? Received a grant to do an installation, and over the summer of 4 months, we actually constructed and started to investigate the possibilities of this membrane. Digital model of the membrane and the actual installation in a gallery at Carleton University. And then going further, taking this membrane and proposing to the city of Ottawa, Tulip Festival pavilions, invest in the structural system. Every season, every year, new pavilions, reconfigured, using the same kit of parts to celebrate the jazz festival, perhaps, or the Tulip Festival. This is another configuration at the bottom, or a pavilion that is native, that is a native Indian. So again, the possibilities of this, but it's completely reconfigurable, the same kit of parts. And then going further, expanding this, this is actually perhaps a performance space, a multimedia performance collaboration with perhaps a composer, an artist. So these are some renderings, detailed study of a joint, interior shots of this. What is not, what I'm not going to be able to show you here, this surface, the surface itself performs. It performs. It actually can be incorporated into what is happening on stage. So that is the objective. And also diagonal cables through the structure allow undulating, the control of the undulating surface so that it perhaps can be coordinated with music. So, to conclude, this is Richard Feynman, brilliant physicist. This correlation, he writes, between simplicity and complexity is common to all our laws. They all turn out to be simple things, although complex in their actual actions. And then he also says, nature uses the longest threads to weave her patterns, so each small piece of her fabric reveals the organization of the entire tapestry. Thank you.